There is a place on this earth where the ground itself is red, not from drought, not from fire, but from one of the most valuable minerals in the modern industrial world. A mineral that builds the planes you fly in, the cars you drive, the cans your drinks come in, and the wiring inside the phone you are holding right now. This place is Jamaica, and for over 70 years, that red earth has been pulled out of the ground, shipped across oceans, refined into aluminum, and sold to the world. Billions of dollars have moved through that supply chain. But if you drive through the communities that sit on top of that same red earth today, you will see something that does not match that number. You will see unpaved roads. You will see overcrowded schools. You will see families stretching every dollar across a week that never seems to have enough days. So the question is not whether Jamaica has wealth underground. It clearly does. The question is where that wealth has been going. And the answer to that question will take us through decades of colonial economics, corporate negotiating power, government decisions, environmental sacrifice, and a structural trap that many resource-rich developing countries know all too well but rarely escape. Let us start at the beginning, because context is everything when you are trying to understand why a country with so much in the ground ends up with so little in the hands of its people. Bauxite is the ore from which aluminum is derived. It sits close to the surface of the earth, which makes it relatively cheap to mine compared to many other minerals. Jamaica has some of the highest grade deposits in the entire world. The island's bauxite was first commercially exploited in the early 1950s, and for the decades that followed, it became the backbone of the Jamaican economy. At its peak, Jamaica was among the top bauxite-producing countries on the planet. The industry employed thousands of workers, brought in foreign exchange, and funded government operations. On paper, the numbers looked impressive. In practice, the arrangement was built on a foundation that consistently favored the multinational corporations, extracting the resource over the country and people providing it. The companies that came to mine Jamaican bauxite were primarily North American aluminum giants. They arrived with capital, technology, and most importantly, leverage. And Jamaica in the 1950s was either still a British colony or newly independent, depending on the year you are looking at. It lacked the legal infrastructure, the technical expertise, and frankly, the bargaining power to negotiate from a position of strength. The initial royalty and tax agreements reflected that imbalance. The corporations paid relatively modest fees per ton of bauxite extracted, and crucially, most of the refining happened outside Jamaica. Bauxite was dug out of Jamaican soil, loaded onto ships, and transformed into alumina or aluminum in Canada, the United States, and Europe. The value-added steps, the ones that generate the most profit and the most jobs, took place somewhere else entirely. This is the first layer of the problem, and it is one that repeated itself across the developing world throughout the 20th century. When a country exports raw materials instead of finished or semi-finished products, it captures only a fraction of the total value of the supply chain. A ton of bauxite is worth significantly less than a ton of alumina, which is worth significantly less than a ton of finished aluminum, which is worth significantly less than the aluminum products eventually sold to consumers. Jamaica was positioned at the cheapest end of that chain, and that positioning was not accidental. It was the result of who had capital, who had technology, and who wrote the terms of the original agreements. Now here is where the story gets more complicated, because Jamaica did push back. In the 1970s, under Prime Minister Michael Manley, Jamaica made a bold and historically significant move. Manley's government renegotiated the terms under which multinational corporations operated on the island. A new production levy was introduced, tying payments to the price of aluminum rather than simply to the volume of bauxite extracted. This meant that when aluminum prices rose, Jamaica earned more. It was a meaningful reform, and it generated a significant increase in government revenue in the short term. Manley also helped found the International Bauxite Association, a grouping of bauxite-producing nations that was partly inspired by the success of OPEC among oil producers. The idea was to create collective bargaining power among countries that supplied the world's bauxite. The response from the corporations and from the United States government was swift, and it was not gentle. Investment dried up. The companies began to look elsewhere, diversifying their supply chains away from Jamaica. Guinea in West Africa, which also holds enormous bauxite reserves, became an increasingly attractive alternative. Australia expanded its production. Jamaica found itself in a bind that resource-dependent nations know well. When you try to capture more of the value of your own natural resources, the companies extracting those resources have options that you do not. They can leave. They can reduce investment. They can shift operations. A mountain of bauxite in the ground generates no revenue if no one is mining it. The economic pressures of the late 1970s and early 1980s pushed Jamaica into the arms of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Structural adjustment programs followed. These programs, which were conditions attached to the loans Jamaica needed to stabilize its finances, typically required reducing government spending, liberalizing trade, and creating more favorable conditions for foreign investment. In practice, for the bauxite industry, this meant the leverage Jamaica had briefly gained in the Manley years began to erode. Concessions were made. The terms shifted back in favor of the corporations, and the cycle that had defined the industry from its beginning reasserted itself. Something important happens psychologically when a country goes through that kind of experience. The lesson that many Jamaican policymakers drew from the 1970s was that being too aggressive in extracting value from foreign investors carries severe risks. Capital flight, job losses, reduced production, international pressure. The lesson that might have been drawn, that long-term structural transformation of the industry was necessary even at short-term cost, was harder to sustain politically. Governments that need revenue now, that have populations with immediate needs, that are under pressure from creditors, do not easily make decisions optimized for 20 or 30 years into the future. So the structure persisted. Bauxite continued to be extracted. A portion of the value continued to flow to the Jamaican government through taxes, royalties, and the production levy. Jamaican workers continued to be employed in the mines. But the commanding heights of the aluminum industry remained outside Jamaica, and the communities most directly affected by the mining continued to wait for a prosperity that the raw numbers of bauxite exports always seemed to promise, but never quite deliver. Let us talk about those communities for a moment, because they are the human face of an economic abstraction. The bauxite-rich parishes of Jamaica, places like Manchester, St. Elizabeth, Trelawney, and St. Anne, contain some of the most significant deposits on the island. They also contain communities where poverty is persistent, where infrastructure is inadequate, and where the benefits of being literally on top of a globally traded commodity are not always visible in daily life. Farmers who once worked land that was acquired for mining found themselves displaced. The rehabilitation of mined land, which companies are legally required to undertake, has been inconsistent. Some areas that were mined decades ago have been successfully returned to agricultural use. Others have not. Water sources have been affected. Dust from mining operations has created health concerns in some communities. The people who live closest to the mines often experience the costs most directly, while the financial gains flow through corporate structures and government budgets that are several steps removed from their daily reality. This is not a story unique to Jamaica. It is the resource curse in one of its most recognizable forms. The resource curse, a term used by economists and development scholars, describes the paradox where countries with abundant natural resources often experience less economic development, more inequality, and sometimes worse governance than countries with fewer resources. The reasons are multiple, and they feed each other. Resource revenues can make governments less accountable to citizens because they do not depend on broad taxation to fund themselves. Resource revenues attract rent-seeking behavior, where powerful interests compete to capture the money rather than creating new economic value. Resource dependence can crowd out other industries because high export revenues push up the currency and make other exports less competitive. And the price volatility of commodities means that economies built on them go through boom and bust cycles that make long-term planning extremely difficult. Jamaica has experienced all of these dynamics to varying degrees. The bauxite boom of the 1950s through the 1970s was not paired with a significant diversification of the economy. When bauxite prices fell or production declined, the consequences rippled through government finances and employment in ways that revealed how narrow the economic base had become. The alumina plant at Alpart in St. Elizabeth was at one point one of the largest employers in the country. When it went through closures and changes in ownership, entire communities felt the impact. The plant has changed hands multiple times, including a notable acquisition by a Chinese company. And its operational history has been turbulent in ways that illustrate how dependent local economies can become on decisions made in corporate boardrooms far away. The fiscal dimension of this story deserves more attention than it usually gets. How much has Jamaica actually earned from bauxite over the decades? The honest answer is complicated. The industry has generated hundreds of millions of dollars in government revenue over its history. But calculating what Jamaica has received versus what the total value of extracted resources represents is genuinely difficult, because the data has not always been transparent, because transfer pricing, which is the practice by which multinational companies set prices for transactions between their own subsidiaries in ways that can minimize tax obligations, has historically been a concern, and because the long-term environmental and social costs of mining are rarely fully priced into the equation. What is clear is that Jamaica's human development indicators have not tracked the wealth that has moved through the bauxite industry. Poverty rates remain significant. Income inequality is pronounced. The infrastructure in bauxite-producing communities has not reflected the volume of value extracted from the earth beneath them. A country that has been selling one of the world's most useful minerals for 7 decades should, in theory, have had the resources to build world-class schools, hospitals, and roads in the regions that bore the environmental and social costs of extraction. The fact that this has not happened is not a mystery. It is the result of specific decisions, structural arrangements, and power imbalances that can be traced and named. There is another dimension to this story that is increasingly important as the world changes, and that dimension is the energy transition. Aluminum is one of the most energy-intensive materials to produce. It is also one of the most recyclable. As the world moves toward renewable energy and as industrial recycling improves, the dynamics of the aluminum market are shifting. But there is another, more immediate dimension of the energy transition relevant to Jamaica's bauxite story, and it involves a different kind of resource altogether. Bauxite mining requires significant energy inputs. The Jamaican economy runs partly on imported oil, which is expensive and exposes the country to price volatility. The heavy industrial operations associated with bauxite and alumina processing are energy-hungry. This is one of the reasons why the full aluminum production chain, the step of turning alumina into aluminum through electrolysis, which requires enormous amounts of cheap electricity, has never been established in Jamaica. Countries like Iceland and Canada, which have abundant, cheap hydropower, host aluminum smelters. Jamaica does not have that advantage, so the island is structurally blocked from capturing the highest value step in the chain, not only by corporate decisions, but by geography and energy economics. This is a painful irony for a country that gets abundant sunshine and sits in a region with significant wind and geothermal potential. Jamaica has been expanding its renewable energy capacity in recent years, which is positive. But the transition has been slow, and the historical lack of cheap electricity has been one of the real constraints on industrial development. It is not the whole story, but it is part of the story. Now let us sit with the governance piece of this, because that is where some of the most important decisions have been made and where accountability matters most. Jamaican governments across party lines, both the Jamaica Labour Party and the People's National Party, have at various points managed the bauxite sector. The revenues generated by the sector have gone into the general budget, which means they have not been ring-fenced for specific developmental purposes. Some countries that earn significant natural resource revenues create sovereign wealth funds or dedicated development funds that are constitutionally protected and managed with long-term objectives. Jamaica has not consistently done this. The revenues have flowed in during good years and been spent, and when the flows declined, the gaps showed. There have been calls from civil society, academics, and some politicians over the years to reform how Jamaica manages its natural resource revenues. The Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, an international standard for open reporting in the mining, oil, and gas sectors, provides a framework that can improve public accountability. Jamaica has engaged with this framework to varying degrees. Transparency is necessary, but not sufficient. Even with perfect transparency, the fundamental question of how much value Jamaica captures and how that value is distributed within the society requires political decisions that go beyond reporting standards. The environmental debt also deserves a full accounting. Bauxite mining is a surface operation, which means it clears land, topsoil is removed, vegetation is destroyed. The red dust that characterizes bauxite regions is visible and pervasive. Noise, vibration, smoke, and disruption to local water systems are documented concerns in affected communities. Land rehabilitation has improved over the decades as environmental regulations have become more stringent, and some mining companies have invested in reclamation efforts. But the cumulative environmental impact across 70 years of industrial-scale extraction represents a cost that has been borne primarily by local communities, while the financial benefits have been distributed more broadly and in ways that have not systematically compensated those communities. There is a concept in development economics called the social license to operate. It refers to the ongoing acceptance by local communities and the broader society of a company's operations. In Jamaica's bauxite regions, that social license has been tested repeatedly. Community protests, legal challenges, and persistent complaints about the gap between corporate promises and lived reality reflect a legitimacy problem that has never been fully resolved. Companies that mine in Jamaica are not invisible villains in this story. Many have invested in community programs, scholarships, and infrastructure. Some have met or exceeded their legal environmental obligations. The problem is structural, not simply a matter of corporate bad faith. The structure of the industry, where the majority of economic value flows outward, is the core issue. So what would it actually look like for Jamaican bauxite wealth to reach ordinary families? The answer is not simple, and there is no single lever that changes everything. But the components of a different outcome are not mysterious. They involve capturing more of the aluminum value chain domestically. They involve using resource revenues to build genuinely transformative infrastructure in affected communities, tied to clear outcomes rather than absorbed into general budgets. They involve environmental remediation that is fully funded by the industries responsible for the damage. They involve transparent, independently audited reporting of revenues and expenditures related to extractive industries. They involve communities in the planning and benefit sharing of operations that affect their land and their health. And they involve diversifying the economy aggressively so that the bargaining position of the government in negotiations with multinationals is not undermined by desperation for any investment at any terms. None of this is impossible. Several countries have done parts of it well. Botswana's management of its diamond revenues is often cited as a case study in how to convert mineral wealth into human development, though Botswana's situation had specific features that do not translate directly to every context. Norway's sovereign wealth fund, built from oil revenues, is the most famous example of long-term stewardship of natural resource income. Closer to Jamaica, countries in Latin America have experimented with renegotiating resource contracts and directing revenues toward social programs with varying degrees of success and political stability. The path is not obvious, but it exists. What makes the Jamaican case particularly poignant is the persistence of the gap between the visible wealth of the natural resource and the daily experience of the people who live near it. This is not abstract. In a community where the red soil is literally a globally traded commodity, where trucks carry that soil to ships that sail to industrial facilities that produce materials used in every corner of the modern economy, a child should not be attending school in a building with a leaking roof. A farmer displaced by mining should not be waiting decades for promised rehabilitation of their land. A family living within sight of an industrial operation generating export revenues should not be asking why the road in front of their house has never been properly paved. These are not unreasonable expectations. They are not the demands of people who do not understand economics or who have simplistic ideas about how wealth is created. They are the reasonable expectations of citizens who watch the resources of their country leave on ships and wonder why the return journey of those resources, as public services, as infrastructure, as genuine opportunity, never seems to complete the circuit. The global aluminum industry will continue to need bauxite. Demand for aluminum and electric vehicles alone is projected to grow substantially as the world electrifies its transportation system. Lightweight, conductive, recyclable aluminum is not going away. Jamaica still has significant reserves. The industry is not finished, which means the conversation about how that industry's benefits and costs are distributed is not finished either. It is, in fact, more urgent than it has ever been. See, the moment to redesign an extractive industry's relationship with the country and communities it operates in is always before the next major wave of investment, before the new contracts are signed, before the next production expansion begins. If Jamaica and its government, its civil society, its communities, and yes, the companies operating there, can engage seriously with the structural questions that 7 decades of experience have made unavoidably clear, then the wealth underground still has the potential to do something different. Something that actually reaches the families who have lived alongside the red earth long enough to know exactly what it is worth to the rest of the world. The red soil of Jamaica is not just a geological fact, it is a political one. And the politics of who benefits from it and who bears its costs are still being written.